You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at JaysAnalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer.
Analysis. Welcome back. This time, James Kelley returns. Had a lot of requests for James to come back. We're glad to have him. We got something unique here. We're going to go into the realm of the bizarre, the weird. We're going to discuss some pretty far out cults. James suggested this idea as a series, and I thought it was an excellent plan to go for. James, how are you today?
Great. How are you doing, Jay?
Doing well. We're going to talk about several different cults. Today we're starting with the Nation of Islam, and as I understand, we're going to do Scientology, we're going to do Jonestown, we're going to do Heaven's Gate, and this is going to be a wild ride, I think.
Yeah, and actually what I had thought of doing is I only prepared for the Nation of Islam segment. So I thought,
I knew we're not going to do them all today. We're going to do one each, one podcast per topic, but I was just giving an outline for what we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's get into it. The Nation of Islam. I read your piece. You've done quite a bit of research on this. In fact, you were telling me that day you've collected like this massive amount of research on the Nation of Islam. And I've got a little bit of info too, so let's get started with this. Tell us about the origins of it and how it gets into some really far out gnostic weird stuff.
Well, the Nation of Islam started apparently in 1930 in Detroit, in the Paradise Valley ghetto, basically, of Detroit, where a mysterious silk salesman who called himself W.D. Fard, Master Fard Muhammad, Wally D. Ford, various aliases. This gentleman, who was kind of light-skinned, definitely not an African-American by most people's admission, would insinuate himself into the houses of poor African-Americans in Detroit. Once he got in there, he would try to sell them silks, which he said were from the old country, from the Middle East. And he would begin to tell them, well, the problem and the reason why you're so poor and why everything's so bad is because you've accepted this Bible and this Christian religion, which the white man has foisted upon you and told you to wait for paradise in the next world, and you have to suffer in this world, that kind of thing. And so he developed a huge following, thousands of people in different cities. And he set up a sort of a paramilitary wing of security called FOI, the Faith of Islam. And he told them that they were joining Islam, which was the, I don't want to say correct, but the proper religion made for African Americans or black people.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually said that the white man needed to be eradicated and destroyed from the earth, and this would be their salvation in the here and now.
You said this guy was not exactly of black descent. Do we know what his ethnic origin was?
No, actually, and I guess I should qualify what I said by saying that no one's sure exactly what his racial composition is or was, but they know it's mixed, whatever it was.
Okay.
So some people have said that the Nation of Islam itself says he came from Saudi Arabia, but that's very doubtful. Some think that he was from a New Zealand, half New Zealand tribesman. Some think he was part Hawaiian. But we have to realize that in the 1930s, in the northern cities, many mostly whites, individuals realized that they could, if they gave themselves a kind of Eastern, pseudo Eastern wise man kind of a persona,
The
that they,
Magi of the East.
yeah, exactly, and that they could. There was a certain bookseller from Chicago, actually. His name was De Laurence, and it may just be pronounced De Lawrence. I don't know, but this person became the biggest selling author in the Caribbean islands, and he just said, I'm offering. Okay, so De Lawrence had a thriving business. He was the number one best-selling author, if you want to call it that, in the Caribbean islands, where the blacks there bought all of his books about occultism and about, you know, homeopathic cures and all this kind of stuff. And his writings were banned by I believe it was the Jamaican government. I think they still to this day they've banned. I think Che Guevara and De Lawrence are banned. Yeah, and I think that speaks to how popular it was. And one of the things that was worrisome to the Jamaicans was that the populace were just throwing aside all the traditional customs that they had learned. I don't want to call it voodoo, but whatever their traditional religious concoction was, they were throwing that aside and saying, no, actually, De Lawrence is where it's at, and we should just base everything on this. So I think that, ironically, some of the people in the government were thinking, well, these people are going to lose their nationalistic pride, which we use to get them to follow our laws. Yeah. So we're going to ban this De Lawrence. Well, this is a guy that De Lawrence had a mail order business in Chicago, and this is where this all takes place. Detroit and Chicago are the two major Nation of Islam cities at first. So there are a lot of people like De Lawrence, and so Fard Muhammad, FD Muhammad, the founder of Nation of Islam, he was just one such person, I would say.
Okay.
He was peddling, these new religious ideas. So I think that I had better go over some of the mythology.
Yeah, please.
Of the Nation of Islam. And before that, I'll say that the first major follower of Fard Muhammad was Elijah Poole, who changed his name to Elijah Muhammad. And he's the putative author of most of the important works that have anything to do with this stuff. So that's the primary sources are books by Elijah Muhammad, mainly.
Before you get into that, do we have any idea of where Fard got his mythos?
Well, that's a great question. Several scholars have said that there's a guy named George Farr who turns up in Chicago as a member of the MSTA, the Moorish Science Temple of America, which is the first religious occult black organization that has any note whatsoever. It had 20,000 members, the MSTA. And apparently Fard Muhammad sort of got some of his ideas about organizing people around sort of alternative religious ideas infused with a black racial consciousness. He got this idea apparently from the MSTA.
Okay.
But he may have been also a member of the UNIA, Marcus Garvey, the Back to Africa guy.
Oh, yeah.
He started his thing in 1914, I believe, or 1916. I forget the date, but it's the teens. And most of the people that we're talking about, including Elijah Muhammad, were members of MSTA or affiliated with them, and also the UNIA. And just as a side note, I read a few things which showed a lot of evidence that Fard Muhammad, his thousands of people that he drummed up, apparently he got those from UNIA and MSTA organizations. He infiltrated them and said, no, this is the fulfillment of all that stuff. This is the real answer.
Wow.
So that's how, out of nowhere in 1930, some, person of unknown racial provenance comes to the black community and says, I'm your leader now, and drums up thousands of members to follow a new idea.
Right.
So anyway, but Fard Muhammad apparently, under another name in Los Angeles, owned a restaurant out of which he sold narcotics and was busted for that and served a few years in San Quentin.
And he lived with a woman he wasn't married to, a white woman, I believe, at the time.
Funny how many of these cult leaders and these new religious movements, how many of their progenitors spent time in jail.
Oh, sure. And prison is a constant theme.
Yeah.
In Nation of Islam, as we all know. Mike Tyson,
Right.
And Elijah Muhammad spent several years in jail because he evaded the draft as a religious principle and told others to do so. And then once those draft evading NOI members were all in the prisons, then they started a prison ministry because they were already there. But anyway, back to Fard Muhammad and Los Angeles. While he was in Los Angeles, he apparently came under the influence of a Hindu, I guess, guru type guy who was a member of the Theosophical Society. And of course, Theosophical Society members, especially, founded in 1875, but as we go into the early 1900s, people who are involved in the Theosophical Society are also usually have their finger in all the other kinds of popularized occultism of the day.
Yes.
New Thought and all that kind of stuff,
right.
Homeopathic cures and so forth. So, yeah, we have a direct line back to the MSTA, which the MSTA, Memorial Science Temple, they had their own scripture, the Holy Quran Circle 7, which was based on this Aquarian life of Jesus Christ, which said Jesus went to India and Tibet and studied with all the gurus there, realized that all wisdom is the same, and realized that, it's the inner self that's united with the essence of God already that you have to realize and work that out.
Yeah.
So I guess to answer your question, it probably comes from the general milieu of the black organizations at the time, the MSTA, but he may have had a specific, non-black, if you will, in the Theosophical Society. Most people weren't black. Kind of like going to a Rush concert, it's like, there's not very many black people here. But, so he may have gotten it from there. And here's the thing about Fard Muhammad. We have a huge FBI file on him that you can read on the FBI's website. And it says, all we know is that he immigrated to the U.S. sometime before 1913. He may be from New Zealand, but we just know this much, that he may be part white and he may be not black at all. But they don't know for sure. So anyway, that kind of sets the stage. But ultimately, Elijah Muhammad got these teachings from Fard Muhammad. This was the core of it. It was that the original race of beings that could think, beings with brains, were all black. They were the original men. Their coming about, their evolution, literally, took trillions of years, and it's analogous to the God giving birth to himself. And this is where we get into the mainstream kind of esoteric cosmogony, birth of the cosmos, or theogony, birth of God. This stuff is very familiar because you go to the New Age bookshelf and you'll find some version of this in almost every book. Well, where did it all come from? Well, I think that that's a long story, but one of the proximal origins of it, I think, is Gnosticism.
No doubt,
Yeah, I mean, because here's the basic, and I said this in my post, but the basic idea is that everything began in darkness. That means an undetermined, not spatially defined, no attributes. It was just an ungrund, a groundless, undifferentiated nothingness. That would not be fecund. That would not have any life to it. So therefore, God had to move.
The non-being or the Ein Sof of Kabbalah.
Absolutely, the Ein Sof, where you have darkness and then a thread of light, starts weaving through the darkness. So there, at that point, as soon as you have motion, you have light, you have a differentiation of the light from the darkness, and then you have all the different directions, because now you have a point of light that's threading around, and it's got to do that in space and time. So you have one being, one God, who's still one, and yet you have all these other little binaries, differentiations, oppositions there. And the whole way of thinking, I covered this a little bit in a paper I wrote about the apeiron, the ancient Greek philosophical view of the the thing that comes before all differentiation. And it's what I seem to get from the early Greek philosophical texts I read was that the reason why everything proceeds out of absolute simplicity into total opposition is that it's got to cover the entire span of all possibilities and keep it confined and defined, so that you'll have light and dark, absolute light, absolute dark, because then it already contains other subdivisions within it. You couldn't have something that's absolutely pure and absolutely undifferentiated go, well, there's 30% black and 70% white. It has to be an absolute opposition, and that's a reflection of the fact that it encompasses all things. So later, you have Plotinus saying distinction is opposition.
Right.
Because he's talking about things that don't leave anything out. On its own sphere, it's got everything there. So anyway, it may seem that we're getting far afield from, the Paradise Valley projects of Detroit.
Well, we're really not, though, because this is the borrowed well stream from which this new movement will draw its foundations.
Sure. And when I started studying the Western esoteric tradition, I was kind of dubious about, oh, wow, everyone's talking about sexual fluids being involved in it. And I thought, surely that's just some sensationalist later scholarship. But after years of research into it, what kind of person would study fluids like that for years? Well, that would be me, I guess. But at any rate, I found out that that is actually almost a component that you can't do without. If you take it all the way back to Indo-European times, the whole Amrita or the Soma.
What about what about the? Am I correct in saying that there's a connection to the Siva Lingam, which is this little post, this little phallic symbol from which we make the association of the seed of life, right? So, and it would stand to reason that moving back, regressing through these iterations, the pagan mind would look at the generative process of how plants, trees come from seeds as they germinate in the ground, as humans come from wombs where the seed has germinated, and so the sort of regressive reasoning back to there must have been an original scission, schism, some sort of birth-giving sense in which one being emerged from another being.
Absolutely. And the thing that when you have gender differentiation and patriarchy, and I'm not going to get into the theories of was the Great Mother precede the patriarchal view, because it's insoluble. But one thing you can do is if you go back to well-attested textual traditions like, let's say, for instance, the Vedas, and then also you have the Iranian text, the Avestas and all that stuff. Well, you do see this idea that birth-giving is, pure birth-giving, divine birth-giving, is that the God rains down fluid on a lower sphere. And this gives material reality to a true reflection. And it's even, there's a water disk at the heart of the person's body in certain Indic texts, which say, well, the higher light reflects in that water disk in the heart. And so the whole idea is that, the divine being pours down this seminal fluid into a lower vessel, and that's the basis of its connection to its origin, and the basis of its inner divinity is that, well, I'm a receptacle for this fluid of yours, So you can see that when people are sitting around saying, well, how are we going to worship this divinity? People start getting, vessels out and filling them up with, fluids. and they start making some, cocktails and imbibing them. It makes sense to the pagan mind, as you said. And so I think it's important for us to, yes, the first time you hear about this, it's kind of like, ooh, there's the shock element. But then after that, I want people to also realize that it's not just simply something that you dismiss as the most disgusting, horrible thing you've ever heard in your life. It certainly is that on the most important level. But on another level, it's man groping around, literally, trying to find the truth with what materials are there.
Yes, I've groped around with a lot of females in this regard, and
That's why. That's why I let.
I always say all I'm doing is comparative religion research, and they tend to get mad and slap me, and I'm saying, well, I'm just doing research. Just trying to find
Correspondence degree with the University of Chicago, yeah, and
No, but you're right. I mean, this is going to play into what you wrote about their cosmology. So this is crucial to understand, sort of the groundwork for where we're going to go in this talk and the work that you've done.
absolutely. And basically, what the whole myth is that okay, so there's nothing but darkness, and it's specifically interpreted as blackness, and it's the analog is there toward the people with black skin would be the original race, those who are in touch with God.
So,
so where did the whites come from?
so the assumption is that temporal priority is somehow a signifier of ontological supremacy, I guess.
Absolutely, and this is an esoteric thing that goes beyond all time. I mean, it's there from the beginning and today, is that you have two sort of categories that are trying to be upheld at the same time in the pagan cosmogony. One is that there has to be some kind of unknown source, the apeiron, the one, that you can't say anything about, but we know it's there by the fact that we can't say anything about it. So there's the stability. But yet there also must be a principle of dynamism, or else you've just got a sterile, nothingness out there that never becomes anything. So you have to have change too. And that apparently in the NOI's view, that was light. Some kind of, because the one is darkness, blackness. Well, then there must be something white, light-giving, something that contrasts with that and is a rotating wreath of light around the original blackness. So to them, that was the Milky Way. That's what Elijah Muhammad said, is look in the sky. Yeah, the Milky Way is out there, this wreath, this light, and of course you've got the Milky Way thing, so it's got the seminal theme in there too. And
so you're saying that there's also not just the question of one and many, or duality in that sense, dialectics and tension. There's also the sense of stasis versus flux, and so the blackness was stable and fixed, and that change and flux arose with light and whiteness.
Oh, absolutely. And another thing I learned from my Apeiron article on my Romeo Cini blog is that, one of the reasons why that these pagan worldviews are so appealing is that you don't just have one binary. It's like the four elements. You have to have two sets of binary, or two binaries, I should say, that have complex relations to one another. You can have hot and wet. You can have hot and dry. You can have, the four elements are usually associated with two properties. So you have the possibility for not just a single binary, which would be just as sterile as having no differentiation, because you've just got two things looking at each other. You don't have any kind of movement necessarily. So yeah, it spins off all these different concepts and all these different narratives. Storylines can be, as the Gnostics proved over and over, you can make storylines out of concepts. And in fact, I don't think you can make stories without them.
Yeah.
And so it's a very fertile. It fructifies the whole.
Well, we're talking fertility, so it makes sense.
Yeah, I was kind of stumbling over words. There were a lot of words that I wanted to use.
The fecundity.
Yes, there was a lot of all the words had fecund in them somewhere. So I was like, well, maybe I'll say something that can't be misunderstood. So no, but what they're doing in the Nation of Islam is they're saying, okay, so we're oppressed by this white race. And keep in mind, in Chicago at the time, in the early 30s, there's Red Summer, which is the worst race riot anyone had ever seen. 37 people were killed. And there was a pregnant black woman that was hung up from a street lamp, and her baby cut out of her, and both killed. So, and this was all in the papers big time. So there was a lot of just, and there were crowds of white people of all ages and both genders standing around laughing at the dead baby and the dead woman. So there's just really extreme, gruesome, inhuman things going on in Chicago at this time. And first thing I thought, being from the South, is, everyone thinks the South is the, and it's understandable. I mean, this is where, slavery happened and all the horrible lynchings. But I mean, they went to the North and look what happened to them there too.
Right.
So there was a disillusionment in the 30s. Plus, in the 1920s, they had many blacks had secured jobs, and there was economic expansion in the 20s. But that stopped in the 30s. And with that came more violence against blacks, because it's like, well, the fewer jobs we have to go around, these people have no jobs now, so they're just kind of leeching off of us, was the mentality. So in this crazy, situation here, you have Elijah Muhammad saying, look, the problem is it's metaphysical. We are the original race, and we're under the thumb of this other white race, which is not the original black race. How did this all happen? Mm-hmm. So this is what they came up with. This is what Elijah Muhammad said, that Fard Muhammad taught him around 6,000 years ago. A black scientist, because that's all there were at the time, were black people, 6,000 years ago, named Yaqub, who's to be identified with the biblical Jacob. He got an idea. It's said that when he was a boy, he was playing with two pieces of metal. One was magnetized, one was not. And he noticed that the magnetized one would attract the other rock, but not the other way around. And he looked up at his uncle, Yaqub did, and said, Uncle, by the time I'm a man, I'll create a race of people that are more powerful than you. And the uncle said something like, well, it must be God's will that you got this prophecy. So it must serve some greater purpose. So what Yaqub did is that he lived around the city of Mecca, and the king of Mecca realized that 30% of the black race was not happy. They were discontented. And he realized that these followers were mainly the followers of Yaqub. So he said, I tell you what, I'll pay you money for you to take all your followers and just go to a different land and leave us in peace. And Yaqub said, okay, I need enough money to start my own society. And he went to the Isle of Patmos, where St. John wrote the book of Revelation. So Yaqub's on the Isle of Patmos 6,000 years ago. And he, with all of his money and his infrastructure, creates a society, a self-contained society, based on a eugenics program to create white people. And the way that he did this is he says, look, I looked with a magnifying glass, I looked into a man, and I saw that there were two men there, two germs. One was black and one was brown. Now, this is before DNA. I mean, this is in the 1930s when these texts were written. Nobody knew anything. I mean, it was not common knowledge, anything about DNA. Chromosomes, yes, they were known about. But the frame of reference still seems to be seminal fluid. So he's saying, you can see the little suckers swimming around in a microscope, and one's black and one's brown. And he said, basically, he made the analogy to the magnetic rock and the non-magnetic rock, saying, okay, if I can create a man that's unlike, in other words, he's got a contradiction in his very, spermatic makeup, then this person will be able to attract the true black people and get them to do things that they, get them to be slaves, get them to betray their origins. But then the whole purpose seemed to be a kind of gnostic thing where it was like, well, this is a penultimate or second to last move. If we separate out the white man germ out of the black man, then he'll have the ultimate enemy to fight against, so he can raise himself to an even higher level of wisdom. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So basically, that's what's been happening.
But yes.
Yeah, it makes sense, but it doesn't. But so ultimately, what happened is Yaqub said, okay, well, we will take people. The black people will breed with each other, and then if it's a black baby, then the doctors and nurses will be in on the eugenicist plot, so they will put a hypodermic needle in the black baby's head, instantly killing it after it's born. Then they'll tell the mother, oh, this is a dead, the baby is in heaven and will meet you there when you die. But if it's a brown baby, in other words, if it's a good chance that this is a splicing of those two germs, the black and the brown, then we'll keep the brown babies, and then we'll breed the brown ones together until finally, after millennia, we get white people. And so a white person is someone whose sort of life essence, their spermatic man inside of them, has been completely drained of any humanity. It's just drained of any kind of power, fecundity, and all of that stuff. So
we're like bleached flour. We've lost our earthiness.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why you have now, just to jump ahead, Farrakhan, the current leader of the Nation of Islam, he will say, we can go to the Scientologists and we can get training from them, because the white man does what he knows to do. He's programmed to basically try to make us follow him, and he uses this great technology to do it, or tricknology, as Elijah Muhammad called it. And so there's a sense in which everything that the white man does, the black man can learn something from, as long as he puts it in the right context. So that's why you can have these little ecumenical meetings between the Nation of Islam and Christians, or Nation of Islam and Scientologists, because the Nation of Islam people are saying, well, I'm learning from you as a white man. I'm not trying to take everything you tell me whole hog. I'm looking at you as a person that has no soul, and a person that can only do what will, try to make the white person survive longer, and then try to destroy me. But we can still shake hands, and I can learn about your technology and turn it against you eventually, but not today. That's the mentality. But that's the Yaqub myth in a nutshell. Basically, the whole idea is, we have to get to the other component now, which is the end times. Borrowing from the Jehovah's Witnesses, Elijah Muhammad said 1914 was the last year. It was the end of the white man's reign.
Interesting.
The 6,000 years was up.
Hey, I've got a little clip here I want to play.
Oh, go for it.
And this is going to fit exactly into what you're talking about.
Farrakhan, frequently what you say makes eminently good sense and is extremely lucid. And then I'm going to read you this quote because we don't have it on videotape. You told congregants just before the Million Man March at a Washington church about the Mother Wheel, a heavily armed spaceship the size of a city which will rain destruction upon white America but save those who embrace the Nation of Islam. It sounds like gibberish, but maybe you can explain it.
Well, sir, you can ask President Jimmy Carter if it's gibberish. You can ask some of the astronauts who went up and saw it if it's gibberish. On the front page of the Washington Post, several years ago, a Japanese pilot was flying across the Bering Straits, and he saw something in his radar that looked like two large aircraft carriers joined together in terms of size. And an aircraft carrier is 440 yards long. Two of them together would be a half a mile by a half a mile. This is that wheel that was spoken of in Ezekiel that has become a reality. It's over the heads of us in North America. And soon you shall see these wheels over the major cities of America. It is above top secret by the United States government. And if it were gibberish, they made an awful lot of money, Mr. Coppola, on that movie called Independence Day, was about that which you call gibberish, and it flooded the theaters.
Yes, it did. It was fiction, and just for the record, what President Carter spoke about was a UFO. There was no specificity about the kind of thing that you're talking about. He was asked whether he believed in UFOs, and he said yes.
And he said he saw it, and he said when he became president, he would open up that information, which he never did.
That's correct.
But that information is leaking out now to the American people.
So now we've co-opted the old alien myth. Ezekiel's cherubim are actually alien spacecraft, and they're going to destroy white America and save those who are members of the Nation of Islam. I couldn't pass up the mothership. Makes me think of what's the 70s funk band, the Mothership?
Parliament.
Yes. The Parliament theology is what we're talking about here.
Parliament / Funkadelic.
Yeah, the Funkadelic George Clinton theology.
Sure, and that's I can't remember the name of the album, but it's the one where George Clinton is climbing out of a UFO. It's very, very interesting. I actually looked into funk and some of the mythology behind it. Very gnostic.
Yes.
And there's a tune, Unfunky UFO. But I think as far as George Clinton goes, you can't beat Funkenteleki.
Well,
It's the origin of the group Urge Overkill, who had a song on Pulp Fiction soundtrack.
yes, I remember Urge Overkill.
Yeah, they took their name from the song Funkenteleki.
There was a Funny Onion article back in the 90s that instead of Bill Clinton, it was George Clinton drops the bomb on Iraq.
Well, I tell you, if it's going to be Hillary, I'll vote for George any day.
Yeah, well, I think a George Clinton presidency would probably be an improvement over anyone presently. But
Democratic dogs, Republican dogs, you know.
so I wanted to set the stage with Farrakhan talking about the alien ships before you get into this section of where we're going.
Yeah, and we'll get back to the mother plane, or originally I think it was the mother of planes. There was a book called The Mother Plane by Elijah Muhammad. It's about a 40-page book, and he goes into great detail about the prophecy. But that is the fulfillment of the prophecy that I was speaking of. Is 1914 is the end of, begins the end times, and this they borrowed directly from Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
And the whole idea is, well, the white men should be destroyed off the face of the earth, utterly obliterated and not even exist anymore. But we're going to allow some time because the black people haven't yet come into their own. They haven't yet, understood the divinity at their core. So therefore, they need time, just like the Jehovah's Witnesses kept pushing it back and saying, well, we need time for you to come to a greater understanding of the implications of this end times. So we don't know when the actual last day will be of this period. We just know the last period's ushered in. So the whole idea is, I guess I'll just kind of give a short description of the mother of planes, is that it's a planet-shaped craft that houses 1,500 attack fighters. It has its own atmosphere, and it has scientists, black scientists obviously, on the mother plane that knows every human being's thought right before they think it. And I'm reminded of Charlie Manson, who said to Vincent Bugliosi in Helter Skelter. Vincent asked him, so if everything is reduced to just thoughts in people's brains, like you say, then how are you going to be the leader of everything? And Charlie Manson said, I'm going to be on top of my thought. Nobody else will. Well, likewise, the whole idea is don't try to fight the mothership if you're, the Strategic Air Command or whatever. If you're the American government or whatever, there's no point because they know exactly what you're going to think a moment before you think it. So they'll just move the ship out of the way of the bomb or whatever and bomb you. So there's no point in trying to resist. And he says the smart white people won't try to resist. They're just sitting around enjoying, their prominence right now, knowing that it will eventually crumble.
Well, this is far out. We've gotten into science fiction land with, we're going to see, I'm guessing, similarities with Scientology's mythology, but that's in a future podcast. But we're obviously treading on similar ground here.
Yeah, the important thing, I think, to look at and to remember is every new religious movement or alternative religious group that I have ever studied that originated in the 20th century has UFOs as a component.
Yes, and that will, I believe, suggest influence from social engineering groups, intelligence agencies, and so forth as sort of experimental test cases of religious engineering.
And you're right on the dot, because one thing we know for a fact from FBI files is that the Nation of Islam was completely infiltrated from the word go. There were highly placed black FBI agents in the Nation of Islam up to almost the highest levels of it from the beginning.
Yeah.
And Elijah Muhammad knew this, and this is my speculation here, but I think it's quite clear. He built this into his mythology to justify the fact that he was going forward with what he was doing, accepting money from the FBI, because in the Yaqub myth, remember, he's part of this society around this king of Mecca. And what does he do? He accepts sums of money from the government there in order to go off and do his own separatist thing. Well, that's exactly what Elijah Muhammad did. He accepted money from the FBI. It's a known fact. What for, we don't know, but then he's preaching separatism and saying, Elijah Muhammad said, if you give us enough land to cover 3 U.S. states, then we'll stop what we're doing and we'll just live there. That was probably never seriously, thought that would ever happen. But nonetheless, the whole idea is we have to justify theologically why we can accept money from the white government and still believe that we're following some kind of higher divine plan, just like Yaqub did, accept money from the king of Mecca and so forth.
Right. This will also come up in a thing I read that I wanted to bring to your attention here in a little bit, related to the intelligence agency tie-in. And this is actually from a book by Joseph Trento called Prelude to Terror. But I'll save this quote before, as we move up into sort of more the modern era of the Nation of Islam. So continue with where you are, and I'll bring in this quote later.
Yes, so the whole idea is basically that's it, but I wanted to double back to kind of the Gnostic mythology of it, because I've already outlined pretty much, there are interesting little details and tidbits to fill out the picture, but that's basically it. That's the whole idea. We've got
exotheology, and exotheology is a favorite of the cults, which is essentially what I was getting at earlier, the idea of this astral theology that's co-opted into a repackaged, refurbished version that serves as the mythology for the group. And the racial component is interesting because, for example, the Christian identity movements utilize some of the same ideology, where they will point to Noah and they will say that the Protestant evangelical white man is the true God race, and all of the other races are, of course, defiled. And the Christian identity movement was in the background of Oklahoma City with Timothy McVeigh. So
yes.
We will constantly see these themes pop up.
And keep in mind, as you know, it's probably obvious to you and I, but maybe not the listeners, that this Christian identity stuff and the idea that there are different races with different values, this kind of fits in with some forms of Western Christianity, especially Calvinism, which would just say, well, some people are born as vessels of wrath. They're here just to wreak havoc or just to be, to take up space, and it's all just a big charade because God knows they're going to be sent for eternal damnation even before they're born. So if you look at more traditional Christianity, non-Calvinist Christianity, even Roman Catholic stuff to an extent, it's going to say, hopefully that, people aren't born to perdition.
Well, it's a genetic predestination is what we're seeing in these different sects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And keep in mind, I forgot this little theme, but in Nation of Islam, because they have a Gnostic esoteric basis for their thinking, even though it's got modern garb to it, that's never been a problem for Gnosticism. Because the whole idea is, well, we're holistic. I don't have to say God's spiritual or material, because God started off as utter blackness, which, what is the apeiron? It's not material nor immaterial. It's kind of before that division. And so therefore, if we have a particle of fluid, of luminous fluid that rotates and creates a black man out of it, we don't have to say, oh, okay, well, do we have to choose science or mysticism? No. As a matter of fact, that's part and parcel of that mother plane thing, is that, well, why can the black scientists know our thought a moment before we think it? Well, because they're in control of the forces of nature, which they basically created, because their own birth is analogous to God's birth out of the darkness.
Right.
So if they are totally conscious of their divine origin, the splinter of divinity within them, then they're going to be able to understand everything about those forces. And in a sense, we could say that, yeah, they are scientists. They are mathematicians, if that is true. So there's always, as we know with the new so-called New Age and occult movements of the last 200 years, there's not a single one of them is unconcerned to deal with so-called science. They're saying, no, we can look at the paranormal, we can look at,
Sure.
mesmerism, animal magnetism, all this stuff is open to empirical investigation.
Yeah, Christian Science is a good example of that comes to mind.
Yes, and keep in mind, Christian Science, we spoke of Marcus Garvey as a progenitor or a forerunner to the NOI, the Nation of Islam. Well, Marcus Garvey, if you look at his speeches, they directly quote from Mary Baker Eddy. They directly quote from many of these New Thought Christian scientists. And he'll say, you have to understand in your heart that you are a supreme, perfect being with infinite wisdom, and things like that.
You just got to find it.
Oh yeah, and keep in mind, Marcus Garvey is kind of using this for very practical, pragmatic purposes. He's like, we just want this back to Africa thing.
Yeah.
It's more of a civil religiosity, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't keep people like W.D. Fard and Nation of Islam people from saying, well, we grew up in our teens. Marcus Garvey's picture was on every respectable middle-class black person's wall. So therefore, we can go back and listen to those speeches and hear those words, and we might interpret them in a more esoteric manner, since now we're heavily infused with all these other influences. So that's a consideration as well. But this mythology, it's very interesting, because if you think about it, I have these quotations here. I wanted to read one, if I may.
Sure.
And this, I think, is from Message to the Black Man, which is one of the more well-known books by Elijah Muhammad, which still isn't very well-known, but still. It's here's the quotation. This is why you will be born again physically. The black man will be born again physically. This is after the white man is destroyed. This rebirth is in order to get rid of that wicked material in the very essence of the sperm of the black man. This wicked material will not be in the black man for anyone to use after the removal of the present world and people. So what would Freud say about all this? You're a black man. Your issue, your fluid, is the opposite of this color, and Yaqub looked into the germ, the physical germ of the human being, and saw that there were two men there, a black one and a brown one, and so you're afraid that after that this issue is going to be used by someone else for nefarious purposes. So it seems very odd to me. But the whole thing seems to be based on this original cosmogony or theogony, where God is born as a wreath of light out of the darkness.
Mm. Wow.
And however, there's a danger to the dynamism, right? That's got to be one of the themes. It would be better if everything was just stasis, because then everything would be stable and everything would be black. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, there must be dynamism, or else, how would you explain being where you are thinking about all these things, right?
Right.
So the Gnostic knower, or would-be knower, has to say, well, how did I get here? Well, there must be some kind of contradiction at the very heart of what I am. For me to reproduce another black man, I have to have a seed that is white, and so there must be some kind of historical process, apocalyptic process, which is going to produce a black seed, And so we have to get that white material out of us, and, if you think about
food coloring might work. You could just mix up.
Well, not only that, but one of Elijah Muhammad's works refers to the essence of the black race as black mud. So it's interesting that he's obsessed with the greatness of all things black, and the how everything that's white is terrible. However, the most joyous occasion in his whole life produces whiteness. And so he has this imagination that there must be, I guess, black semen or black issuing forth in the hereafter, the better world after the whiteness is all extinguished. So I don't know, but it certainly has all the elements that religious people are concerned with. Are just packed in there,
Reminds me of a situation with a girl that I had a few dates with, who worked on the film Maleficent. She was the visual effects person on Maleficent. and she said that after they, excuse me, had put in several hours of work on different scenes on the different Disney characters and whatnot, the fairies and so forth, that they used a lot of pink. And Angelina Jolie, who was very much involved in the production process of the film as well as starring in it, has this strange view that because of her radical feminism, she hates the color pink. So she's she's in a war against this color. And so she actually made the visual effects people go back and do hours and hours more work erasing any bit of pink in the film Maleficent because it's feminine.
Right, right. It's kind of like, I mean, at this point I'm just riffing off of that idea, but it's kind of like, all right, well, you know, we all understand, right, some of the more earthbound references to pink, right? So it's like, well, this represents femininity and everything that's soft and everything that, you know, as Prince sang, soft and wet. You know, but we also want to realize that, you know, the idea of feminism is that we're more masculine, or we're more, you know, effective and virile and able to control things than you are. So we have to actually kind of like have a kind of like Alien. Who's the guy? Geiger? Who's the guy that did Alien?
H.R. Geiger did the art, yeah.
It's like we have to have a Geigerian exoskeleton of metal sharpness around our soft and wet, you know, interior, so that we can show you, hey, we're completely covered up with this hard shell of, you know, of mechanical force that's going to cut through your flesh, you know, cut your, you know, reproductive member off, but we're going to be completely covered up, and we're not vulnerable, and we don't have that kind of passivity, you know, that you may associate with the pink. So yeah, it's this dialectical reaction, you know.
Very bizarre too. A war on a color. It's very strange.
Sure, but I mean, if you think about it, you know.
I mean, I understand the logic, the illogic of it, but it's just a strange superstition to me. The war on a color.
Sure, and I had some other things too. I think part of the power of this white-black frame of reference here for the NOI, it's, you know, obviously we have race. That's the most obvious frame of reference. We also have the, you know, seminal fluid, which I've probably already said enough for 10 years worth. It's another frame of reference, but there's also the eye. It says here that Elijah Muhammad believed that God made the human eye as a white sphere surrounding a black sphere. And the idea was, well, the black sphere is first, and it decided to create a sphere of light around itself, just exactly like we said the birth of God. And thus, he's talking about how white people have different colored eyes. They don't have the dark hazel eyes. They have all these different shades. And Elijah Muhammad says, would you trade your beautiful black eye, surrounded with the beautiful white, for a green blue eye? No, you wouldn't. It is a more beautiful eye, clear black, and clear white around it, like his universe he made. He was black inside, then he said, let there be light on the outside. So then we have the cosmic frame of reference. The Milky Way is the wreath of white around the black center. You know, it's like a reverse Oreo. You know,
I was going to say an Oreo. It's the universe, the Oreo universe theory.
Yeah, what's Oreo spelled backwards? Oeoro? Something like that. But yes. So the whole idea is, to me personally, just trying to look at it semiotically and to say, why does this have so much power for this group? I think just like a lot of Gnostic mythologies or whatever, they work on a lot of levels simultaneously, and they talk to each other these different levels. They explain each other.
Yeah. How does Jacko fit into this?
What's Jacko?
Jacko's the '80s tabloid term for Michael Jackson because he went.
Oh.
They would always call him Jacko to shorten it, but since Jacko went from brown to white, I wonder what Elijah Muhammad would have to say about that.
Ironically, I think I know exactly what he would say. There's part of Yaqub. There's a book called Yaqub that he wrote, which is actually a compilation of earlier sayings, but nonetheless, in the book Yaqub, he says, "Look," he says, where did and this is not me talking here. This is Elijah Muhammad's actual book. So this doesn't reflect my views, obviously, but I just have to throw out that caveat before I start this stuff in case someone moves to the middle of the video and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what's this guy talking about?" But Elijah Muhammad said, "Okay, well, the white man makes fun of us because we have these simian features, these kinky hair and big lips and just these flared nostrils and stuff." He's like, but he said, we didn't start off like that. We started off with very smooth, totally opposite features of those. But he said one unnamed black scientist decided that he would move to West Africa and run around in the jungles there and bring a group of black scientists, black people with him, and prove that they could make it in a hardy, environment where they had to constantly fear for their lives and throw spears at animals and stuff. And so it was a kind of a different eugenics program where he's like, I'm going to prove the toughness of the black race. Mm-hmm. He said, and it's only after they moved to West Africa, this group, another social eugenics experiment, that they started producing these severe-looking features. And so I think the implication is that the way that black people look now, there's nothing about them that's really, truly good about the way they look, according to Elijah Muhammad. He just he believes that in the future, now that they all get this consciousness of their destiny, that's a very ancillary thing, those features that I spoke of. The kinky hair will go away. The lips will get smaller. In other words, they'll look just like white people, but their skin will be darker. So there is a strange idea there, and it may be a case of, well, they're always telling us we look bad. They're always telling us we look like freaks. And there's a tendency to be like, well, that's because we didn't originally start off that way.
Wow.
So that seems to be the mentality there. But I don't know if that's what Michael suffered under or what.
Captain EO. Captain Oreo.
Definitely.
Do you know what Captain EO is?
I've heard it before, but I don't know.
That was Jacko's special exhibit at Disneyland, where he was Captain EO, and he.
Oh, did he have a white suit on?
No, that was the Smooth Criminal video. Prior to that, back in like 86, 87, George Lucas put together this big, I don't even know what to call it, kind of an early version of IMAX, I guess, at Disney World, and it was Captain EO, and it was Michael Jackson was Captain EO, and he was fighting alien invaders. So ironically, it actually is kind of a gnostic exotheology with Jacko as the savior. But
well, I wonder if the EO is a reference to the EIO, or the chant or the god that's made up of only vowels in so many Gnostic texts.
I wouldn't be surprised. And in fact, I think I saw a clip a long time ago of somebody actually making that connection. And of course, we know that George Lucas, borrows all his stuff from Joseph Campbell. So there's probably a good chance that that's true. But I didn't mean to get off the field. I was just injecting a little bit of humor into this madness.
You can always count on any popular reference to go right over my head, which is funny in and of itself. But no, actually, I was at Disneyland in I think it was around 1988 or 9 with my family. I was a kid.
Well, Captain EO would have been there. I can't believe you didn't see it.
No, I mean, I was walking through, wanting to go to Tom Sawyer's Island or whatever, and I saw this big, huge wall with Michael Jackson on it, and that must have been what that was.
Yeah.
But there was a huge line. It was like, and I remember thinking to myself, I don't want to sit there for an 11-minute movie. I don't want to sit in line for 2 hours or stand in line. So I ended up just doing whatever. The path of least resistance was my whole mentality on that Disneyland trip. So I was just going where there were no lines. But anyway, back to the madness. where do we go from here?
Well, here's a quote from Joseph Trento's book, Prelude to Terror, that ties in. David Theodore Belfield was born November 10th, 1950, in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, the third of 5 children of Charles and Jackie Belfield. David is not of Arab or Persian descent, or even a Muslim by birth. He's a black man. His family has always been respected by leaders in the community. In 1968, David left New York, where his family had moved from North Carolina, for Howard University in Washington, D.C. Like many young black men, he dabbled in black causes. He joined a group organized along military lines, but he left after a year because it opposed his interest in Marxism. During his period, David met a Korean War deserter and a musician who convinced him that Islam was a way for black men to find their destiny. David Belfield, the quiet kid from Bayshore, Long Island, found a voice and an acceptance in this new Islamic world that was not available to him anywhere else. David explored all forms of Islam. As he got to know the most militant Islamic leaders in the U.S., he became more and more radical himself and more at odds with the Chicago version of Islam being preached by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Soon he changed his name to Dawood Salahuddin, the name of the great warriors of Islam, the name of one of the great warriors. Dawood began frequenting an unfashionable Orthodox mosque on Park Road in D.C., run by a very unusual and flawed man. Ernest X.X. McGee had recast himself as the fanatical spiritual leader Hamas Abdul Khalis. Malcolm X, while making his pilgrimage to Africa, became convinced that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was more like a crooked televangelist than a servant of Allah. Khalis shared his belief and became a follower. After Malcolm X was murdered, Khalis took his faith one step further. He formed an Orthodox movement called the Hanafi Muslims and quickly began recruiting Muslims in the Washington area who were looking for an alternative to the Honorable Elijah. For Dawood Salahuddin, Hamas Abdul Khalis's fundamentalist version of Islam presented an undiluted love for the discipline and laws of religion. Khalis was a good family man. He and his extended family lived in a Washington upper-class suburb largely populated by blacks called Gold Coast, bought for the Hanafi sect by basketball star Lou Alcindor, whom Khalis renamed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Now, this chapter on Salahuddin, David Belfield, goes on to discuss his being co-opted and used in terror plots that were being essentially organized through Al-Qaeda and the Saudi Arabian mosque that's controlled in D.C. It's the, what is it called, the Islamic Center in D.C. And this is largely a Saudi thing. And so Belfield would unfortunately be caught up in the propaganda of Al-Qaeda. But the fascinating point is that Trento's chapter discusses how he was essentially entrapped, more or less, as a true believer into these terror events that were essentially being conducted by Western intelligence agencies. So I don't advocate everything that Trento says. Trento tends to be sort of a Democratic Party type guy, but his book Prelude to Terror is really good. It does have a lot of insights on this kind of stuff. So there we have the intelligence tie-in with a specific case of David Belfield to the Nation of Islam and other groups. But it wasn't. I'm not saying that the Nation of Islam or the Hanafi sect or Kareem were involved in terrorism. What I'm saying is that these circles of these strange groups lead to other circles of strange groups, yes, where people are entrapped. And I think that's telling as well when we look at the dubious nature of these groups and their leaders.
Absolutely, and it's important. Two things came to mind as you were speaking. One is I never dealt with Islam. I never said a word about Islam. Just let me briefly say that the first thing that whenever you study Nation of Islam, the first thing, if you know anything about Islam, is you're like, this has nothing to do with Islam whatsoever. That seems to be the first impression I had. These people have read a few verses out of the Quran and they know nothing else. Well, a couple of responses to that would be yes and no. As time goes on, Warith Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad, he actually studied in the Middle East, I believe. He studied actual Islamic theology with Islamic theologians, and he was disgusted when he sort of came back and was around his father. He's like, this man doesn't know anything. And he actually said he had an Islamic scholar with him, and apparently Elijah Muhammad had been pronouncing his name Elijah Mahmad. And this theologian from the Middle East, I believe, said that's pronounced Muhammad. And it took some convincing to get him to change his mind about that. So you can imagine the kind of disillusionment that comes from that. So there's kind of the, oh, wow, let's dog on them and say they're just using the word Islam and they know nothing about it. Well, that's sort of true, but if you look at the panoply of different beliefs that fall under that aegis of Islam, Sufi Islam was always very popular in West Africa, where a lot of the slaves came from.
Yeah.
And I think the original, slave religions, the Islam were mainly Islam, at least according to one book I read. And these had to be quashed by the 1830s. All the vestiges of the Sufi Muslim, faith that the slaves had were forgotten. The next generation had come up, and it's like we don't even remember that stuff anymore.
Yeah, and Sufism is very Gnostic as well.
That's exactly what I was driving at, yes. The Sufis get along with anybody who's a Gnostic. Sufis do not get along with anyone that's traditional that says, look, you can't do that because this is what God taught. I mean, I know that's probably way overgeneralizing because there are a million shades in every group.
Yeah.
But I think the basic thing is the Sufi is like the Gnostic wing of Islam everywhere.
Right.
And if you want to make a Sunni Islam person mad or Muslim mad, then start talking about Sufism. They'll get very, very upset about that. Just as upset as I get being Eastern Orthodox and someone talks about Sophiology. It's the same exact thing. But Sophiologists and Sufi people love each other.
Yeah.
They can't get enough of each other. So the point, and they all love the idea of God's fluids coming down and bathing us too. But that's more of what I said before. But anyway. So I guess the other side of it is, yes, at least the founders of Nation of Islam didn't know anything about Islam really. But their teachings, ironically, drawn from the Western esoteric tradition, sync up quite nicely with Sufi Islam. And later on, the second theme is later on, Nation of Islam people actually start looking into traditional Islamic theology, and they continue to go, oh, well, we know what that is now, Farrakhan will say. They'll say, I understand what Islam is now, but we have a special destiny that's higher than that. So I'm aware of that. I've studied that, and I positioned it vis-a-vis my beliefs. And even though, Fard Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad didn't know about this stuff, they knew about what was important, and they didn't need to know that other stuff. So they may seem like unlettered, rough-hewn, preachers, but actually they knew a lot more than they let on, that kind of thing.
Well, and this character David Belfield that I read that I was just reading about, reading the quote from the book, that's precisely what happened with him. He studied his way out of Nation of Islam and into actual radical Islam.
And keep in mind, you said, what's the common thread here? As things go on and people say, I don't need that Elijah Muhammad guy anymore, what's kept intact is the militancy. What's kept intact is the race mythology. And what's kept intact is just the signifiers. Oh, well, I need a banner so that I can have my assault rifle and know where to point it. And it's way more. I don't mean to reduce their views to saying they're just mindless, people walking around. They have their reasons. I disagree with them, but
yeah,
it's not as simple as that. I don't want to reduce them to just, he doesn't know what he's doing. But there was something, Nation of Islam and the Black Muslim movement answered some needs in the black community at the time. But we need to talk about Malcolm X, I think, because people are going to probably think, well, you're 40 minutes in here and you haven't said a word about the most popular and recognized person that has to do with it. Well, Malcolm Little, former male prostitute and drug abuser, joined the Nation of Islam, became a high up in minister in Nation of Islam. Then he realized that Elijah Muhammad was fathering children with all of his secretaries, his 4 secretaries. He was fathering children and doing nothing for them. Just, you're still my secretary with the same pay. Yes, I fathered that child, but I'm not going to actually treat it as my kid. And then the straw that broke the camel's back, there was a relationship with a relative, a female relative. So there's incest. This was well known amongst the highly ranked NOIs that Elijah Muhammad just basically had sex with anyone that was in his inner circle that he wanted to, that was female, even a relative. So whenever Malcolm Little, later Malcolm X, found out about this, if you read Alex Haley's book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, you'll get the impression that Malcolm X was just scandalized by this, and he's like, I'm done, I'm out. But that's not actually what happened. What happened is after Malcolm X found out about this philandering, he justified it and started trying to justify it to other people in the Nation of Islam, but the other jealous, highly ranked NOI members used this knowledge as a wedge between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, started using this against him. Oh, you're trying to spread this knowledge. You say you're trying to justify it, but you're really trying to denigrate our leader. And they came close to bringing about the downfall of Malcolm X before it actually happened. So Malcolm X, under all this pressure, then changes his story and says, oh, well, this is despicable what this man is doing. So I'm going to form Muslim Mosque Inc., my own spin-off schismatic group, and I'm going to be the leader of it and forget this stuff. And I'm doing it because this guy's having sex with his own family members. So that's how it really happened. And then the next thing you know, Malcolm X is assassinated, probably from the orders of Louis Farrakhan, or at least with Farrakhan's knowledge and approval. So that's really what happened with Malcolm X, and that's pretty much what you need to know about it.
Now, are there any more details on the assassination that you uncovered?
No, not so much, because I didn't focus on that much, but I'm sure there's a lot that could be said. I know that the main thing I've extracted from it all is you need to read Alex Haley's best-selling book, but don't read it as a primary source, which is what most people have done. Alex Haley's book, Alex Haley was a big Republican Party person who wanted to see the civil rights movement as the only viable thing that society can do to avoid turning every black person into a Malcolm X. So that's how he couches all of his arguments about Malcolm X. You will not get the real story. You'll get some details, though, that you can't get anywhere else. So as long as you're reading that book with the right spectacles on, you have to. It's a main source. But basically, Malcolm X is not a person who, is some kind of righteous, fighter for freedom or whatever. He's just a guy that tried to start a schismatic NOI group because he was edged out.
Did he have a change in his views where he got more mainstream?
In a sense, he did. Like I said before, if you look at the NOI between the early 30s and then today, almost every individual that is in any position of prominence in the NOI, there's some kind of accommodationism that comes into play. I mean, think about Farrakhan. First of all, Warith Muhammad, he knew what Islam was. And he's like, look, we're going to slowly edge this thing into mainstream Islam. We're going to start making everybody do all the stuff they do in Mecca, all the stuff they do in the Middle East. And that's what led Farrakhan to say, no, I'm going to refound the NOI based on the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. So it's the reformed NOI is actually what we call the NOI now. And so, but then Farrakhan, who's still preaching the fire and brimstone, why he has to die kind of thing, he realized with his association with Jesse Jackson and other more mainstream individuals, he realized the kind of power and influence and numbers he could reach if he toned it down. So there you'll have different, the seesaw effect where Farrakhan tones it down. But I think that he basically doesn't change his views on anything. But he realizes that you have to wheel and deal a little bit, and he realizes you can always, in a Gnostic manner, reinterpret the white-black, Armageddon. You can reinterpret it a million different ways to suit whatever you want to do at the time. If you want to have a summit meeting with white people, Scientologists, you can do that. Because you don't have to tell them the inner Gnostic purpose of the meeting. You can let them know what they need to know. and get what you need from them in order to bring about the higher synthesis,
Interesting. Wow. Well, anything else that you have on this topic that you feel needs to be expressed?
Nothing much at the time. No, I think it pretty much covers it. I do plan on writing more about this. I'll probably have either, another guest blog on your site, or I'll have it on Romeo Cini, and you can link to it.
Okay.
But I'll have more. I hated to put the one little mini post that I put there about the ambrosial nectar theme. I didn't want people to think that that's the whole thing. That was just the easiest thing for me to write about because I happened to be reading that material at the time. I might do another post on the Yakub myth. I might do a post on Farrakhan and the mother plane. And what I didn't feel like doing was just a general introduction to NOI, which actually was what I hoped this, constituted, which I think we did a decent job.
Yeah, definitely. And your site is Romeo Sign. Spell it for us.
It's RomeoSyne.
And that is WordPress.com?
Yeah, Romeo Cini at WordPress.com.
All right, James Kelley, thank you. And we're going to conclude it here. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis. If you like what you hear, please do subscribe. Follow my stuff, and if you feel so inclined, become a paid subscriber. It does help with website costs. Thank you, James Kelley.
Okay, Jay, over and out.
And what are we going to be talking about next time? Heaven's Gate, or which one? Scientology? What do you want to do next?
I'm thinking Jim Jones, People's Temple, Jonestown.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you, James.
Okay, thanks.